Welcome, everyone. I'm excited to kick off our presentation today. Today, we'll be exploring socialism in Europe and the Russian Revolution. This is a fascinating topic that covers the rise of socialist ideas across Europe and the pivotal events of the Russian Revolution. Over the next few slides, we'll look at the origins, key figures, and impacts of these historical moments. So let's get started. Let's take a look at the contents of this presentation. As you can see, we've organized the key topics into several sections that trace the social, political, and economic changes in Russia and Europe from the late 19th century through the early 20th century. Starting with the first section, the age of social change, we explore the broader societal transformations happening during this period. This sets the stage for understanding the revolutionary movements and ideological shifts that follow. Moving on, liberals, radicals, and conservatives highlights the different political forces vying for influence, shaping the direction of reform and revolution. Correspondingly, support for socialism shows how socialist ideas gain traction among various groups, eventually leading to significant upheaval. Next, we delve into the economy and society, which examines the economic structures and social conditions that fueled unrest, including the role of the peasantry and working class. This theme recurs throughout, emphasizing its importance in driving change. The section on the coming of socialism to Europe offers a broader context, illustrating how ideas from across the continent influenced Russia's revolutionary path. The Russian Empire in 1914 provides a snapshot of pre-war Russia, setting the scene for the upheavals ahead. Then we focus on key revolutionary events, such as the Russian Revolution, the February Revolution in Petrograd, and the Revolution of October 1917. These pivotal moments transformed Russia from an empire into a socialist state, with profound consequences. Throughout, we see the impact of war, First World War, and the First World War and the Russian Empire, which exacerbated social tensions and accelerated revolutionary momentum. Following these upheavals, topics like After February and What Changed After October help us understand the immediate aftermath and the profound political shifts that occurred. Finally, the presentation explores the efforts to build a new society, such as making a socialist society, as well as the challenges faced during Stalinism and collectivization. These sections reveal how revolutionary ideals were implemented and often contested over time. And of course, the global influence of these events is highlighted in the last sections, showing how the Russian Revolution inspired worldwide movements and altered international politics. Overall, this structured outline helps us piece together a complex, transformative period in history, connecting social change, revolutionary ideas, and political upheaval into a cohesive narrative. The age of social change marks a pivotal moment in history, starting with the French Revolution. It really opened up the idea that society could be fundamentally transformed. Before the 18th century, society was mostly divided into estates and orders. Think of the aristocracy and the church, who held most of the economic and social power. It was a very rigid structure. But after the revolution, people started to believe that change was possible, that the way society was organized could be challenged and reshaped. This idea didn't stay confined to Europe alone. In India, thinkers like Raja Rammohan Roy and Derozio were actively discussing the significance of the French Revolution. They saw it as a symbol of change and progress, and many others in India debated how these European ideas might influence their own society. So, the revolution sparked a lot of conversations about social and political reform, ideas that resonated across different parts of the world. Overall, this period marks the beginning of a broader movement towards questioning traditional authority and imagining new social possibilities, something that would influence many future struggles for change around the globe. Let's talk about liberals, radicals, and conservatives, and what sets these groups apart. These terms often come up when discussing political ideologies, but they also reflect different ways of thinking about change and stability. Liberals generally favor gradual reform and believe in the power of institutions to improve society over time. They tend to support policies that promote social justice, individual rights, and economic regulation, all while maintaining the existing political framework. Radicals, on the other hand, are more willing to challenge the status quo. They often advocate for fundamental or revolutionary change, believing that the current system is deeply flawed and needs to be overhauled entirely. Think of radicals as those who push for rapid, comprehensive transformation. Conservatives usually emphasize stability, tradition, and preserving established institutions. They are cautious about change, preferring to protect what has worked historically, and often view rapid reforms as potentially disruptive or harmful. Connecting this to our overall theme, understanding these different perspectives helps us see why political debates can be so charged. Each group has different visions for what society should look like and how it should get there. Recognizing these differences allows us to better appreciate the complexities of political development and social change. When we look at liberals during this time, their vision was for a nation that tolerated all religions. For example, in Britain, they supported the Church of England, but they also believed that other religions should be accepted. In contrast, places like Austria and Spain favored the Catholic Church, which influenced their policies. Liberals also opposed the unchecked power of dynastic rulers, meaning they didn't want kings or queens to have absolute authority. Instead, they aimed to protect individual rights from government overreach. A key idea for liberals was the establishment of a representative, elected parliament. They believed laws should be interpreted by a well-trained judiciary that operated independently from rulers and officials, ensuring fairness and justice. However, it's important to note that they weren't full Democrats in the modern sense. They didn't support universal adult franchise, meaning they thought only men of property should have the right to vote, and they definitely did not support women voting at this time. All of these points connect to the broader theme of liberalism, promoting individual rights, limiting government power, and advocating for a system based on legal and political equality, even if their ideas about who should participate in voting were more limited than what we might consider democratic today. Radicals, or those who sought fundamental change, wanted a nation where the government was truly based on the will of the majority of the people. They believed that political power should reflect the interests of the common citizens, not just a privileged few. Many of these radicals supported women's suffragette movements, advocating for women's right to vote and participate fully in society. Unlike liberals, who also pushed for reforms, radicals specifically opposed the privileges held by great landowners and wealthy factory owners. They weren't against private property itself, but they strongly disliked the concentration of property and wealth in the hands of a small elite. This desire for broader economic and political equality ties into the overall theme of the presentation, which is about different groups pushing for social reforms and challenging the existing power structures of their time. Radicals played a key role in shaping the push for a more inclusive and equitable society. Conservatives, as you can see here, were generally opposed to radicals and liberals, who often wanted rapid change. Back in the 18th century, conservatives tended to resist change altogether, preferring the stability of tradition. However, by the 19th century, their views evolved a bit. They came to accept that some change was inevitable, especially as societies evolved and new ideas emerged. But what remained central to their beliefs was the importance of respecting the past. They believed that change should happen gradually, through a slow and careful process, so as not to disrupt the social order. This approach reflects their broader desire to maintain stability while cautiously adapting to new realities. It's a key part of understanding the different political perspectives during this period and how they relate to the overall theme of societal change versus stability. Now let's talk about industrialization, which was a pivotal period in history. During this time, new cities emerged and regions focused on developing their industries. Railways expanded rapidly, connecting places and fueling economic growth, and this entire era is often referred to as the Industrial Revolution. Industrialization changed the way people lived and worked. Men, women, and even children moved into factories to meet the demands of increased production. However, life in these factories was tough. Long work hours, low wages, and unemployment were common challenges faced by many workers. This period also sparked a wave of revolutionary ideas. Some nationalists, liberals, and radicals believed that the existing governments established in Europe after 1815 were outdated and unjust. They wanted change and often saw revolution as the way to achieve it. In countries like France, Italy, Germany, and Russia, these revolutionary movements gained momentum. Leaders like Giuseppe Mazzini in Italy, for example, worked tirelessly to overthrow monarchies and push for democratic reforms. All these developments, industrial growth and revolutionary efforts, are interconnected in shaping the modern world we know today. They reflect the desire for progress, equality, and better governance that continues to influence us. Now, let's talk about the coming of socialism to Europe. Socialists believed that private property was the root of many social problems at the time. They argued that if society, rather than just individuals, controlled property, then more attention would be given to the collective social interests. Essentially, they wanted a system where the community's well-being took priority over individual ownership. Socialists actively campaigned for this change, advocating for a shift in how property was viewed and managed. However, it's important to note that socialists didn't all share the same vision of the future. Different groups had different ideas about how socialism should be implemented and what the ideal society would look like. This movement was a significant part of the broader push for social and economic reform during this period, aiming to create a fairer and more equitable society. Now, let's take a closer look at Karl Marx. Marx and Friedrich Engels argued that industrial society was fundamentally capitalist. This means that the key players, the capitalists, own the capital invested in factories. The profit that came from these factories was actually produced by workers who labored day in and day out. Marx believed that this created an unequal system where workers were exploited. He argued that workers had to overthrow capitalism and the rule of private property to achieve true equality. Marx's vision was that, to free themselves from this exploitation, workers needed to build a radically socialist society. In this society, all property would be socially controlled, removing the power of private owners. This idea of a socialist society was a stepping stone toward what Marx called a communist society, a classless, stateless community where resources are shared equally. This connects to our overall theme of social change and the pursuit of equality, highlighting how revolutionary ideas can transform societies. By the 1870s, socialist ideas had really begun to spread across Europe, gaining momentum among workers and thinkers who believed in social equality and economic justice. To coordinate these growing movements and ideas, they established an international organization called the Second International. This body served as a platform for socialist and labor parties to come together, share strategies, and promote their common goals. It was a crucial step in transforming socialism from scattered ideas into a unified international movement. This development ties into the overall theme of how revolutionary ideas spread and organized themselves during this period, shaping the future of political activism and social reform across the continent. Support for socialism in Germany played a significant role during this period. In Germany, various associations worked closely with the Social Democratic Party, or SPD, helping it to gain parliamentary seats and increase its influence. This shows how organized efforts and alliances were crucial in advancing socialist ideas. Moving beyond Germany, by 1905, socialists and trade unionists had begun forming political parties in other parts of Europe. In Britain, they established a Labour Party, and in France, a Socialist Party. These developments mark an important shift toward more organized political representation for workers and socialists across Europe. However, despite these advancements, it's important to note that, up until 1914, socialists had not yet succeeded in forming a government in any European country. This highlights the ongoing challenges they faced in transforming their influence into actual political power. Connecting this to the overall theme, these efforts and struggles illustrate the growing strength and organization of socialist movements, even though they hadn't yet achieved government leadership. It's a reminder of how social and political change often takes time and persistent effort. Let's talk about the Russian Revolution. It all started with the fall of the monarchy during the February Revolution of 1917. This was a major turning point, as it led to the collapse of the old regime and the end of centuries of Tsarist rule. Then, later that same year, the socialists took control of the government through what's known as the October Revolution. This event was critical because it marked the beginning of a new socialist government in Russia. When we refer to the Russian Revolution, we're actually talking about these two key events, the February and October revolutions, together. They're connected, and together they fundamentally changed Russia's political landscape, setting the stage for the rise of the Soviet Union and shaping the course of 20th century history. In 1914, the Russian Empire was ruled by Tsar Nicholas II, who was the autocratic leader of this vast territory. At that time, the empire stretched across many regions that we now know as independent countries or states. It included present-day Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, parts of Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus. Additionally, it encompassed Central Asian countries, as well as Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. The majority religion within the empire was Russian Orthodox Christianity, which played a significant role in shaping the culture and identity of the Russian people. However, the empire was incredibly diverse, and it also included communities practicing Catholicism, Protestantism, Islam, and Buddhism. Understanding this diversity is crucial because it highlights the complex social fabric of the Russian Empire on the eve of World War I. This vast and multi-ethnic empire faced many internal challenges, which would later influence its trajectory through the 20th century. These details help us see how the empire's size and diversity set the stage for the significant upheavals that followed. Let's talk about the economy and society in Russia during this period. Interestingly, about 85% of the Russian population were engaged in agriculture, which was actually higher than in most European countries. For comparison, France had around 40% and Germany about 50%. This heavy reliance on agriculture meant that Russia was a major exporter of grain, playing a crucial role in the global food market. When we look at industry, it was somewhat scattered, but there were key areas like St. Petersburg and Moscow where industrial activity was more concentrated. During the 1890s, we saw a significant boom. Many factories were established, and the railway network expanded greatly. This expansion wasn't just about transportation. It also attracted more foreign investment into Russian industry. As a result, coal production doubled, and iron and steel output quadrupled, marking impressive industrial growth. Most of this industry was privately owned by industrialists. However, the government did supervise large factories to some extent, mainly to ensure minimum wages and limit working hours. Still, working conditions were tough. Sometimes workers had to work up to 15 hours a day, compared to the 10 or 12 hours typical in Western factories. All of this reflects a society in transition, still heavily agricultural, but beginning to industrialize rapidly, setting the stage for the social and economic changes that would follow. Let's take a closer look at the economy and society during this time. Workers were clearly divided into different social groups and also by skill level. For example, metalworkers saw themselves as the aristocrats among workers, which shows a clear sense of hierarchy even within the working class. Women made up about 31% of the factory labor force, but it's important to note they were paid less than men, reflecting gender inequality. These divisions among workers were also visible in how they dressed and behaved, yet despite these differences, workers still united at times to strike and demand better conditions. Shifting to the countryside, most land was cultivated by peasants. However, large portions of land belonged to the nobility, the crown, and the Orthodox Church. Just like the workers, peasants were divided. Some resented the nobility and their control. They had little respect for the landowners and often wanted the land of the nobles to be redistributed to them. This desire sometimes led to violent actions, such as refusing to pay rent or even murdering landlords. Overall, these social divisions, whether among workers or peasants, highlight the underlying tensions in Russian society. They also set the stage for larger conflicts and calls for reform, which are essential to understanding the broader historical context of this period. Let's take a closer look at the concept of the commune, or mir, in Russian peasant life. Peasants would come together periodically to pool their land, creating a collective resource. This system allowed them to share their land and resources more equitably. Then, when the time came, the mir would divide the land among individual families based on their specific needs. This method helped ensure that everyone received enough to sustain their household. The key idea here is the communal approach to land management, which played a significant role in maintaining social stability and supporting agricultural productivity. Connecting this to our overall theme, the mir exemplifies how collective cooperation was vital in rural Russia, shaping their social and economic organization over centuries. Before 1914, all political parties in Russia were actually illegal, which made organizing and expressing political ideas quite difficult. One of the key parties was the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, founded in 1898 by socialists who believed strongly in Marx's ideas. Since it was considered illegal, they had to operate secretly. At the same time, the peasants formed their own party, the Socialist Revolutionary Party, in 1900. Their main goal was to fight for peasants' rights and to push for land owned by nobles to be transferred to the peasants themselves. Now, it's important to understand that social democrats and social revolutionaries didn't always see eye to eye, especially when it came to peasants. Lenin, for example, believed that peasants weren't a single, united group. Some were very poor, while others were relatively wealthy. This difference in perspectives played a significant role in shaping the revolutionary movement in Russia. All of these points highlight how complex and divided the social and political landscape was during this period, setting the stage for the revolutionary changes to come. Now, let's look at the key differences between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, believed that in a society like Tsarist Russia, which was highly repressive, the party needed to be very disciplined. They thought it was crucial to control who joined and to ensure that members were committed and of high quality. This strict approach was seen as essential for leading a revolutionary movement effectively. On the other hand, the Mensheviks had a more open approach. They believed that the party should be accessible to everyone, similar to what was happening in Germany at the time. They thought that inclusivity and broad participation would strengthen the movement. So the core difference here is about discipline versus openness. The Bolsheviks prioritized a tightly controlled, ideologically committed group, which they saw as necessary for revolutionary success. The Mensheviks, however, favored a more inclusive strategy, believing that a broader base would lead to a stronger, more sustainable movement. This divergence highlights a larger theme in revolutionary movements: how to build an effective organization capable of leading change. And understanding these differences helps us see how these two factions shaped the course of Russian history. All right, so during this period, Russia was still an autocracy, meaning the Tsar held all the power and wasn't accountable to any parliament. But many Russians wanted change. Liberals, for example, campaigned actively to end this autocratic rule and push for a more representative government. They weren't alone in this effort. The Social Democrats and Socialist Revolutionaries, along with peasants and workers, united during the 1905 revolution to demand a constitution that would limit Tsar's power and give people a voice. Interestingly, support for these ideas wasn't limited just within Russia. Nationalists in places like Poland backed the movement for greater self-rule, and Muslim reformers known as jihadists supported change in Muslim-majority areas within the empire. At the same time, the economy was struggling. Prices for essential goods skyrocketed, which meant that real wages for ordinary people actually fell by about 20%. This economic hardship fueled unrest and made the call for political reform even stronger. So this slide highlights a really turbulent time, a mix of political activism, national aspirations, and economic hardship, all challenging the status quo and pushing Russia towards significant change. Today, let's talk about the 1905 revolution, a pivotal moment in Russian history. It all started when 4 members of the Assembly of Russian Workers were dismissed at the Putilov Iron Works. This dismissal sparked a call for industrial action, which quickly gained momentum. Over the next few days, more than 110,000 workers in St. Petersburg went on strike, showing the growing unrest and demand for change. The situation escalated when a procession of workers, led by Father Gapon, decided to march peacefully to the Winter Palace to present a petition to the Tsar. However, as they approached the palace, the police and Cossacks attacked the procession. This brutal attack resulted in over 100 workers being killed and around 300 wounded. This tragic event is known as Bloody Sunday, and it marked a turning point. It ignited widespread outrage and a series of protests, strikes, and unrest across Russia. This chain of events is what we refer to as the 1905 revolution. It was a crucial step in challenging the autocratic rule and pushing for reforms, connecting directly to the broader theme of revolutionary change in Russia. So, during the 1905 revolution, we see that strikes erupted all across the country, and many universities had to close down as a result. This widespread unrest led professionals like lawyers, doctors, engineers, and other middle-class workers to band together and establish what was called the Union of Unions. Their main demand was for a constituent assembly, essentially a body that could help shape the future of Russia's government. In response, the Tsar allowed the creation of an elected consultative parliament, known as the Duma. However, after 1905, most of the committees and unions operated unofficially because they were declared illegal by the authorities. The Tsar's approach to the Duma was quite dismissive. He dismissed the first Duma after just 75 days and the second Duma within 3 months of their election. His goal was clear. He didn't want any questioning of his authority or any reduction in his power. To ensure this, he changed the voting laws to favor conservatives and then packed the third Duma with conservative politicians. As a result, liberals and revolutionaries were effectively kept out of the process, which shows how the Tsar was trying to maintain strict control over political reform. This whole period highlights the tension between the push for reform and the Tsar's resistance to losing authority, a theme that runs throughout Russia's path to revolution. Let's talk about the Duma. The Duma is the Russian parliament, serving as the legislative body in the country. It plays a crucial role in shaping laws and policies, acting as a key institution in Russia's political system. The Duma's responsibilities include approving the budget, passing federal laws, and overseeing the executive branch. Its structure and functions reflect Russia's approach to governance, blending elements of representative democracy with strong executive influence. Understanding the Duma helps us grasp how Russia's political decisions are made and how power is distributed within the government. This connects to the overall theme of how different political systems operate and influence policy outcomes. So let's talk about Russia during the First World War. On one side, we have the Central Powers, which included Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. These were the main aggressors opposing the Allies. The Allied powers, on the other hand, consisted of countries like Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, Romania, Japan, and later the United States. Russia's entry into the war was initially quite popular among the Russian people, who saw it as a chance to defend their nation and national honor. However, the Tsar of Russia at the time, Nicholas II, didn't really consult with the main political parties in the Duma before making decisions about the war, which caused some dissatisfaction. Over time, support for the war effort started to decline as hardships increased and the realities of war became clear. Anti-German sentiments also grew strong within Russia, which is why they changed the name of their capital from St. Petersburg. originally a German name, to Petrograd, to sound more Russian and boost national pride. Another factor that hurt the autocracy was the Tsarina Alexandra's German origins, which fueled suspicion and resentment. Compounding this was the influence of her advisors, especially a monk named Rasputin, whose reputation and actions made the monarchy even more unpopular among the Russian people. All these issues, military setbacks, nationalist feelings, and internal unrest, began to weaken the Russian Empire from within, setting the stage for significant changes ahead. On the Eastern Front, the First World War played out quite differently from what we saw on the Western Front. Russia's armies faced some tough times and suffered significant defeats in Germany and Austria between 1914 and 1916. In fact, by 1917, there were over 7 million casualties, which shows how intense and devastating the fighting was. As the Russian troops retreated, they didn't just leave everything behind. They took deliberate steps to deny resources to the enemy. They destroyed crops and buildings, which was a harsh but strategic move to prevent the Germans and Austrians from living off the land. This scorched earth tactic had serious consequences back home. It led to over 3 million refugees fleeing the destruction within Russia itself. So, this slide really highlights the brutal nature of the Eastern Front and how it impacted both the military situation and civilian lives, tying into our overall theme of how war affects nations in multiple ways. During the First World War, Russia faced significant challenges in its industries. In fact, the country had relatively few industries of its own, and its access to industrial goods was severely limited because Germany controlled the Baltic Sea, which was a key supply route. By 1916, the situation worsened as railway lines began to break down, making transportation and communication even more difficult. At the same time, many able-bodied men were called up to serve in the army, which led to labor shortages across the country. Small workshops that produced essential goods had to shut down because there weren't enough workers. Meanwhile, a large portion of the grain harvest was sent to feed the army, which meant that food supplies for civilians, especially in the cities, became critically low. As a result, bread and flour became scarce, and by the winter of 1916, this scarcity led to widespread unrest. Riots at bread shops became quite common as people struggled to get enough food for themselves and their families. All of these issues, the industrial shortages, transportation breakdowns, and food scarcity, highlight how the war strained Russia's economy and society, setting the stage for deeper unrest and ultimately revolution. Let's take a closer look at the February Revolution in Petrograd. As many of you know, Petrograd was divided geographically. The workers' quarters and factories were on the right bank of the river Neva, while the more fashionable areas, including the Winter Palace and official government buildings, were on the left bank. This division highlights the stark social and economic differences within the city. In February 1917, the shortages of food and basic supplies hit the workers' quarters hard, creating a tense and unstable situation. Meanwhile, the members of the Duma, or parliament, wanted to keep their elected government intact. They were opposed to the Tsar's attempt to dissolve the Duma, which added to the growing unrest. On February 22nd, a key event happened, a lockout at a factory on the right bank. The very next day, workers in 50 factories struck in solidarity, and notably, many of these strikes were led by women. This collective action marked what became known as International Women's Day, symbolizing the important role women played in the revolution. All of these factors, the food shortages, the strikes, and the leadership of women, set the stage for the larger upheaval that was about to unfold. This moment really underscores how economic hardship and social activism ignited the revolution, connecting to the broader theme of how ordinary people challenged autocratic rule. In this slide, we're looking at the February Revolution, a crucial turning point in the broader context of revolutionary change. It all started when demonstrators, mainly workers, reached the very heart of Petrograd, Nevsky Prospect. This was a bold move, symbolically bringing their protests directly to the city's center. As the demonstrations grew, They surrounded the fashionable districts and important government buildings, which obviously alarmed the authorities. In response, the government imposed a curfew, trying to contain the unrest. Despite these measures, the demonstrators didn't disperse easily. They left for the evening but returned on the 24th and 25th of February, showing their resilience and determination. On February 25th, the government responded by suspending the Duma, which was a significant step because it reflected their attempt to control the political situation amidst mounting chaos. Then, on February 26th, the protests intensified again, with crowds returning forcefully to the streets on the left bank of the city. The following day, a dramatic event occurred. The police headquarters were ransacked, symbolizing a break in authority and a push for change. The streets were filled with people raising slogans demanding essentials like bread, higher wages, better working hours, and democracy itself. This sequence of events highlights how quickly the situation escalated from protests to outright upheaval, setting the stage for larger revolutionary changes. It's a vivid illustration of how ordinary people's demands for better living conditions and political rights can ignite a major movement. So, during the February Revolution, the government once again called out the cavalry to suppress the demonstrators. But this time, the cavalry refused to fire on the crowds, which was a huge turning point. Things escalated when an officer was shot at a military barracks, and this act of defiance inspired 3 other regiments to mutiny. By the evening, these soldiers had come together to form what was called a Soviet or a council, specifically the Petrograd Soviet, located in the same building where the Duma met. This was a clear sign that the revolution was gaining momentum and that the soldiers and workers were no longer willing to follow orders that kept them in oppression. Then, on February 28, a delegation from the Soviet went to see the Tsar. Military leaders advised him to step down, recognizing the collapse of his authority. Finally, on March 2, the Tsar abdicated, ending centuries of Romanov rule. The leaders then established a provisional government, which aimed to guide Russia toward a better future. They decided that Russia's future would be decided by a constituent assembly, elected through universal adult suffrage, meaning every adult would have a vote. This marked a crucial turning point, setting the stage for the broader changes Russia needed to move toward democracy and eventually, the Bolshevik Revolution. After February, we see a significant shift in Russia's political landscape. Army officials, landowners, and industrialists gained influence within the provisional government, shaping its policies. One of the key changes was the lifting of restrictions on public meetings and associations, which allowed more freedom for political groups to organize and express their views. This led to the establishment of Soviets, such as the Petrograd Soviet, which appeared everywhere and became powerful centers of workers' and soldiers' representation. In April 1917, a major event occurred. Vladimir Lenin, the Bolshevik leader, returned from exile. His return was a turning point. Remember, Lenin and the Bolsheviks had been opposed to the war since 1914, seeing it as a disastrous conflict that only benefited the elites. When he arrived, Lenin quickly laid out his vision through what he called the April Theses. These demands were clear and radical. He wanted an immediate end to the war, land transferred to the peasants, and banks nationalized to take control away from the bourgeoisie. These ideas became the foundation of Bolshevik strategy moving forward and were critical in shaping the direction of the revolution. They also connected directly to the broader theme of revolutionary change, people seeking to reshape Russia's society and economy in their own interests. After February, we see some significant changes taking place. The Bolshevik Party, for instance, was officially renamed as the Communist Party, marking a new phase in their identity and objectives. During this period, trade unions started to grow in number, giving workers a stronger voice. Soldiers, committees were also formed within the army, which helped organize soldiers and coordinate their efforts. In June, about 500 Soviets, or workers' councils, sent representatives to an all-Russian Congress of Soviets, showing how these councils were becoming more influential across the country. However, it wasn't all smooth sailing. The Bolsheviks tried to stage demonstrations in July 1917, but these were harshly suppressed, and many of their leaders had to go into hiding or flee the country. Meanwhile, in the countryside, the peasants were pressing for land redistribution. They were inspired by the socialist revolutionaries, who encouraged them to seize land, which many did between July and September of 1917. This period was really marked by a lot of unrest and rapid change, setting the stage for even bigger developments ahead. Now, as the conflict between the provisional government and the Bolsheviks intensified, Lenin became increasingly worried that the provisional government might establish a dictatorship. To prevent this, on October 16, 1917, Lenin convinced both the Petrograd Soviet and the Bolshevik Party to agree on a bold plan: a socialist seizure of power. To organize this, they set up a military revolutionary committee led by Leon Trotsky, whose job was to coordinate the takeover. Interestingly, the date of the actual event was kept a secret to catch the government off guard. A few days before the uprising, on October 24, Prime Minister Kerensky left the city to call in more troops, which was a strategic move. Early on the morning of the uprising, loyal military forces seized key buildings, including 2 Bolshevik newspapers, a clear move to cut off Bolshevik communication. Meanwhile, pro-government troops were dispatched to take control of important infrastructure like telephone and telegraph offices, and to safeguard the Winter Palace, which was the seat of government. This sequence of events was carefully planned to ensure the Bolsheviks could seize power swiftly and decisively, marking a turning point that would reshape Russia's future. So let's talk about the events of October 1917, which marked a major turning point in Russian history. The Military Revolutionary Committee played a crucial role here. They ordered their supporters to seize key government offices and arrest the ministers. It was a bold move to take control of the government from within. Later that day, the ship Aurora, which had become a symbol of the revolution, shelled the Winter Palace, signaling the start of the uprising. Meanwhile, other vessels moved down the Neva River, taking over various military positions to consolidate their control. By the end of the day, the city was effectively in the hands of the Bolsheviks, and the ministers surrendered without much resistance. This swift action demonstrated how prepared and organized the Bolsheviks were for this revolutionary change. Now, this wasn't just a military coup, it was also supported politically. At the All-Russian Congress of Soviets in Petrograd, the majority of delegates approved of the Bolshevik actions, giving them a legitimacy that was vital for their future rule. Of course, there was heavy fighting, especially in Moscow, as opposing forces resisted the Bolsheviks' rise. But by December, the Bolsheviks had managed to control both Moscow and Petrograd, securing the core areas of Russia. All in all, October 1917 was a well-coordinated and strategic revolution that set the stage for the Soviet era, dramatically reshaping Russia's political landscape. After October, we see significant changes across the country. Most industry and banks were nationalized in November 1917, meaning they came under state control. Land was declared social property, which essentially meant it belonged to everyone, and peasants gained the right to seize land from the nobility. In the cities, the Bolsheviks enforced the redistribution of large houses, dividing them according to the needs of families. They also banned the use of old aristocratic titles, signaling a clear break from the past. To symbolize this new era, new uniforms were designed for the army and officials, following a clothing competition held in 1918. The Soviet hat, known as the Budyonovka, was chosen as a distinctive symbol. And finally, the Bolshevik Party was renamed the Russian Communist Party, reflecting the shift towards a new ideological identity. These changes marked a decisive break from the old regime and set the stage for the revolutionary transformation of Russian society. Let's take a look at the Soviet hat, known as the Budyonovka. This type of headgear was quite distinctive and held specific cultural and practical significance during the Soviet era. It often served not just as a part of uniform, but also as a symbol of identity and belonging. The Budyonovka was typically made from durable materials, designed to withstand harsh weather conditions, which was essential given the often severe climates of the region. What makes this hat particularly interesting is how it reflects the broader themes we've been discussing about Soviet symbolism and identity. It's more than just clothing. It's a piece of history that communicates a lot about the era's social and political landscape. As we connect this to the overall presentation, think about how such items serve as tangible links to the past, reminding us of the everyday realities and the collective identity of the Soviet people. The Budyonovka is a small but meaningful example of how clothing can carry cultural and ideological significance. So, what changed after October? Well, in November 1917, the Bolsheviks actually held elections for the Constituent Assembly, but they didn't quite succeed in winning it. Then, in January 1918, when the Assembly rejected many of Bolshevik measures, Lenin took decisive action and dismissed it altogether. By March 1918, the Bolsheviks had made peace with Germany at Brest-Litovsk, which was a huge step in consolidating their power, but also meant giving up a significant amount of territory. As a result, Russia essentially became a one-party state. The Bolsheviks kept tight control over trade unions and every aspect of political life. The secret police, initially called the Cheka, and later the OGPU and NKVD, played a key role in punishing anyone who criticized the party. Now, this environment also affected cultural life. Many young writers and artists initially rallied around the party, hoping to contribute to the new Russia. But as censorship tightened, many became disillusioned because their creative freedom was seriously limited. All of these changes marked a significant shift from the revolutionary ideals to a more authoritarian, controlled state, which was central to understanding the overall transformation of Russia during this period. When the Bolsheviks ordered land redistribution, it caused a significant upheaval in the Russian army, leading to its breakup. This move alienated many soldiers and supporters who were either loyal to other political ideologies or simply opposed to such radical changes. Non-Bolshevik socialists, liberals, and supporters of autocracy all condemned the Bolshevik uprising, viewing it as a threat to their visions for Russia's future. In response, their leaders retreated southward, organizing troops to oppose the Bolsheviks, who were often called the Reds. During 1918 and 1919, two main groups emerged as the dominant forces controlling most of Russia: the Greens, or socialist revolutionaries, and the Whites, who were mainly pro-Tsarist. These factions weren't just fighting each other. They also received backing from foreign powers like France, America, Britain, and Japan. As the Civil War raged on, the situation on the ground grew chaotic. Looting, banditry, and famine became widespread, making life incredibly difficult for ordinary Russians. This period was marked by intense conflict and suffering, as different groups fought for control and the future of Russia. All of these factors highlight how the Civil War was not just a political struggle, but also a human tragedy that shaped the course of Russian history. Now, let's look at the Civil War period and its impact. Supporters of private property, particularly among the white factions, took quite harsh measures against peasants who had seized land. This was part of the broader struggle over land and power during this turbulent time. By January 1920, the Bolsheviks had gained control over most of the former Russian Empire, and their success was largely due to working closely with non-Russian nationalities and Muslim groups known as jihadists. However, this cooperation didn't always work out, especially when Russian colonists themselves became Bolsheviks. An example of this is Khiva in Central Asia, where Bolshevik colonists brutally massacred local nationalists in the name of defending socialism. To address some of these issues, the Bolsheviks granted political autonomy to many non-Russian nationalities within the USSR, aiming to manage diverse interests more effectively. But not all policies were popular. For instance, they pushed through measures like discouraging nomadism, which was deeply unpopular among many traditional communities. These policies reflect the complex and often contentious process of unifying a vast and diverse empire under Soviet rule. All these points highlight the ongoing struggles and strategic decisions that shaped the early Soviet Union's approach to governance and nationalities. During the Civil War, the Bolsheviks took control of industries and banks, keeping them nationalized to ensure state ownership. They also allowed peasants to cultivate their land, demonstrating what collective work could achieve. This was a crucial step towards creating a socialist society where resources and production were managed centrally. To guide this process, they introduced a system of centralized planning, most notably through the 5-year plans. These plans set out economic goals and priorities, focusing heavily on industrial growth. During the first 2 plans, from 1927 to 1932, and then from 1933 to 1938, the government fixed prices to encourage the rapid expansion of industry. This approach of centralized planning led to significant economic growth. We saw a boost in industrial production and the emergence of new factory cities, transforming the Soviet Union into an industrial power. All of these steps were aimed at building a socialist society based on state control and plan development, which was central to the overall vision of the revolution. Let's talk about the efforts to create a socialist society through rapid industrialization. As you can imagine, this fast-paced construction, especially in places like Magnitogorsk, where a steel plant was built in just 3 years, often led to poor working conditions. Workers faced tough lives, and in the first year alone, there were around 550 work stoppages, highlighting the challenges they faced. Despite these hardships, there were significant advances aimed at improving workers' lives. An extended schooling system was developed, opening up opportunities for factory workers and peasants to attend universities. This was a crucial step toward education and social mobility. Additionally, social infrastructure was put in place. Creches were established within factories so that women workers could bring their children to a safe place while they worked. Public health care was made affordable and accessible, and model living quarters were built to improve living standards for workers. However, it's important to note that these efforts had uneven results, largely because government resources were limited. While these initiatives marked progress, they also highlighted the ongoing challenges in building a truly socialist society. These efforts reflect the broader theme of balancing rapid growth with social needs and resource constraints. By 1927-1928, the towns in Soviet Russia were facing a serious problem with grain supplies. The government had set fixed prices for selling grain, but the peasants refused to sell at those prices. This created a significant shortage that threatened the country's food security. Stalin, who had taken over the party leadership after Lenin's death, responded with firm emergency measures. He believed that wealthier peasants, known as kulaks, along with traders, were hoarding grain in the hope of selling it at higher prices later. In 1928, party members went on tour and conducted raids targeting these kulaks. The goal was to seize their grain stocks and break their resistance. As the shortages persisted, Stalin made the decision to move toward collectivization, merging small farms into large, collective farms to increase food production and control. This slide highlights a pivotal shift in Soviet policy, emphasizing how economic pressures and ideological goals drove the move toward collectivization, which would have profound effects on rural life and the broader trajectory of the Soviet Union. After 1917, land was redistributed to peasants, which was a significant change. However, to develop modern farms and operate them efficiently along industrial lines with machinery, the Soviet government believed they needed to take further action. The key concept here is the need to eliminate kulaks, the wealthier peasants who were seen as a threat to collective farming. This meant taking land away from individual peasants and establishing large, state-controlled farms, known as collectivizations. Starting in 1929, Stalin's government pushed a policy called collectivization, where all peasants were forced to work together on collective farms, or kolkhozes. The idea was that by pooling resources, labor, and machinery, farms could become more productive and efficient. The profits from these kolkhozes were shared among the workers, which was supposed to incentivize cooperation. But this policy wasn't welcomed by everyone. Many peasants resisted, feeling that their land and way of life were under threat. Some responded by destroying their livestock and equipment. As a result, between 1929 and 1931, the number of cattle fell dramatically by about one-third. This resistance highlights the intense social upheaval caused by Stalin's push for rapid industrialization and modernization of agriculture. It also illustrates the broader theme of how revolutionary policies can lead to significant conflict and hardship within society. Now, let's talk about Stalinism and collectivization. During this period, anyone who resisted collectivization faced severe punishment. Many were deported or exiled as a way to enforce the policy. Interestingly, peasants who resisted often argued that they weren't wealthy and didn't oppose socialism itself. Their main issue was that they simply didn't want to work on collective farms for various reasons, which highlights the resistance from the ground up. Stalin's government did allow some independent cultivation, but it wasn't treated kindly. These independent farmers were often viewed with suspicion and dealt with harshly. Despite all this effort to collectivize agriculture, the results weren't immediate. Production didn't increase right away, and the period from 1930 to 1933 saw some of the worst harvests in Soviet history. These bad harvests led to a devastating famine, which killed over 4 million people. So this chapter shows how the push for collectivization was met with resistance and hardship, and it underscores the serious human cost associated with these policies, connecting to the broader theme of the challenges faced during Stalin's rule. Let's take a closer look at Stalinism and collectivization. During this period, many members within the party criticized the chaos and confusion in industrial production caused by the planned economy, as well as the impacts of collectivization on agriculture. These critics believed that the policies were not working effectively and were causing hardships. However, Stalin and his supporters saw these criticisms as threats to socialism itself. They accused these individuals of conspiracy against the state, framing them as enemies of progress. By 1939, this led to over 2 million people being imprisoned or sent to labor camps. Most of these individuals were innocent of any real crimes, but they had no one to speak up for them. Under immense pressure, many were forced to give false confessions through torture, and tragically, many were executed. Among those targeted were talented professionals whose skills and contributions could have benefited the country. This dark chapter highlights the oppressive atmosphere of the era, where dissent was silenced and fear reigned, ultimately connecting to the broader theme of how Stalin's policies shaped Soviet society. The Russian Revolution and the rise of the USSR had a significant global impact. However, it's important to note that many existing socialist parties in Europe didn't fully agree with how the Bolsheviks seized power. Their methods and policies sparked debate among socialists across the continent. At the same time, the Bolsheviks inspired the formation of new communist parties in many countries, such as the Communist Party of Great Britain. They also actively encouraged colonial peoples outside Russia to consider following their example of revolutionary change. This influence extended beyond Europe. Non-Russian individuals from various parts of the world participated in events like the Conference of the Peoples of the East in 1920, which aimed to promote anti-colonial and revolutionary ideas. They also joined the Comintern, an international organization founded by the Bolsheviks to unite pro-Bolshevik socialist parties worldwide. Some of these future leaders and activists even received education in the USSR's Communist University of the Workers of the East, further spreading Soviet ideas and strategies. Overall, these efforts illustrate how the Russian Revolution's ideas and the USSR's influence reached far beyond its borders, shaping global revolutionary movements and inspiring people across different nations and colonies. So, by the 1950s, it became clear even within the Soviet Union that the government style wasn't fully aligned with the original ideals of the Russian Revolution. While the country had made significant progress, its industries and agriculture had developed, and the poor were being fed, there was a downside. The government had denied its citizens essential freedoms and relied on repressive policies to carry out its development projects. As we moved toward the end of the 20th century, the global reputation of the USSR as a socialist country had declined quite a bit. Despite this, it's important to recognize that many people still held respect for socialist ideals. This shows that, although the political system faced criticism and challenges, the core ideas of socialism continued to resonate with many of its citizens. This slide really highlights how the USSR's influence and image evolved over time, especially in relation to its original revolutionary goals and the realities of its governance.